Welcome everyone to our 14th installment of our Everything MDM webcast series, brought to you by EnterWorks by Winshuttle. Hi, I'm Suzanne Heron, our Marketing Programs Manager for the EnterWorks line of business for Winshuttle. In today's virtual conference session, Allyson Taft and Libryia Jones from Amplify will discuss how to deliver MDM in an agile environment and maximize value and adoption. Carrie Young will be joining us later today on the call, but Allyson Taft is a client director at Amplify. She is responsible for leading the Amplify project teams on client engagements, driving successful project delivery, and ensuring her clients' success. Allyson's experience includes financial planning, consulting, and contract negotiations with Team Caliber Gaming, supply chain management, and production planning with WestRock, and a variety of lean initiatives and need assessments with Emory University Healthcare. Libryia is a project director at Amplify, providing management across multiple projects, ensuring scope stability, budget control, and on-time delivery, as well as developing systems and tools to drive delivery success across the organization. Libryia's experience includes consulting at North Highland and Deloitte, software implementations at Exactly Corp and the Home Depot, as well as business process review and process improvement at the Home Depot. Before we get started, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Winshuttle and EnterWorks, let me share a little bit more about us. Winshuttle is a specialist in data management and process automation. We offer an all-in-one data management platform for multi-domain MDM, PIM, and DAM. This means that you can implement multiple domains of data on a single instance of our solution without installing any additional software. Our solution is highly configurable, meaning it can be implemented with little to no programming, and because of that, typically offers a very low total cost of ownership compared to other MDM solutions. Our solution can be deployed as a fully managed solution in the cloud, on your own private cloud, or your own data center. It's highly rated by all the industry analysts, including Forrester, who rated EnterWorks as a leader in both PIM and MDM. We are the only PIM and MDM solutions provider that is ranked a leader on both the Forrester PIM and MDM waves. Winshuttle has over 2,500 customers across the globe, and we work with the leading manufacturers, distributors, and retailers in most industry verticals, including food and beverage, CPG, apparel, automotive, and home furnishings. It is my honor now to turn it over to Allyson and Libryia from Amplify. Ladies, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Allyson Taft at Amplify. Thank you for that introduction. Amplify is a strategy and MDM consulting firm. We lead implementations, we do change management projects, and today we are going to talk to you a lot about Agile and MDM. I'm going to actually hand it over to Libryia. I have lived Agile projects from a consulting standpoint and then also from a client directing standpoint, and I can say confidently that Libryia has more experience in Agile than anyone else at our organization. And there's nobody that I would trust more to lead Agile in any vertical than Libryia Jones. So Libryia.
Oh, wow. No pressure there, Allyson. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the intro. Okay, my name is Libryia Jones. And as Suzanne said, she gave you my background. I've worked in MDM for over 5 years, and I am an Agile certified practitioner, which means I have a license to do this. And I'm currently running an Agile project for a major retailer. And before we go on, I want to give you guys a couple of rules of engagement. And thing one, Suzanne has been nice enough to manage the slides. So every once in a while, I will just ask Suzanne to advance forward. Not now, go back. The other thing is, just a warning about me, I tend to talk pretty fast from time to time. So if I run through something too quickly, feel free to just drop in the notes and ask me to repeat anything that I've gone through too quickly, or ask me to slow down or repeat something. It's fine. The other piece is, I know that we're all in a scenario where we're working from home. And so you may hear some background noise. I'm going to ask for some patience and some grace with that. I do own a dog. I put him up in my daughter's room, but he's a big dog. So if he barks, you may hear it. So just going to ask for some patience there. We're going to talk about Agile in MDM. But before we get there, I do want to say that Agile is pretty agnostic of the software, right? So the principles of Agile and the principles we'll talk about today apply across any type of software development. There's nothing special necessarily about Agile in MDM. MDM is a very special software in itself, right? And when you couple the two, there are some nuances and some challenges, but those challenges kind of span any software. But we're going to focus on MDM today. And this conversation is assuming that you know a little bit about Agile. You don't have to be a whiz about Agile to get through this conversation. The principles that we'll talk about today are likely familiar to you. If they aren't, it's fine. We'll do a quick overview of what Agile is and touch on the definitions. But if you do know a lot about Agile and you've been on Agile projects, then quite a bit of this will hit home for you. Also, if you are a project manager or a PMI certificate holder, Scrum Master, anything, just so you know, this will also count as PDUs for you. So bonus points. All right, let's move on to the next slide. All right, so let's talk quickly about what Agile is. Overall, Agile is a methodology that allows requirements and solutions to evolve through collaborations and self-organizing in cross-functional teams. So the Agile Manifesto pretty much embodies what Agile really is about and what are the major principles of Agile. If you click the button, Suzanne, the first will pop up. So Agile favors individuals and interactions over processes and tools, right? So it's really about the people. It's really about the developers. It's really about the end users. It's really about the business and their requirements and our ability to interact over what the process and the tools are. The processes and the tools enable the individuals and that collaboration. The next one is customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And what we mean there by contract negotiation is identifying exactly what it is we're going to build and going back and forth about that up front, right? So Agile favors customer collaboration throughout that process over sitting down and negotiating what's going to be built and locking that in. And we'll get into that in detail. The other is, about to pop up. The next one is working software over comprehensive documentation. And this feels almost like a duh, right? Everybody at the end of the day wants working software. The thing is for Waterfall, the initial focus is on comprehensive documentation. It's on, let's get this on paper. Let's get it written and solidified what we're going to build. Where Agile says, you know what, let's focus first on building out some software that we can actually use. Let's make that our main focus first. The last is responding to change over following a plan. And this is where it gets a little bit uncomfortable for a lot of clients, right? Because everybody wants to follow a plan. At the end of the day, we've got to report out our progress. We've got to report out on a schedule. We've got a budget. We've got things that we've got to control in our projects. But the benefit of Agile, and one of the things that Agile favors, is being able to quickly respond to change. Let's quickly get our software out there and understand how it works and make changes based on that. So overall, Agile really is focused on collaboration, delivering functionality fast, and being able to be flexible and respond to change. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about why go Agile. So a lot of projects, a lot of customers, a lot of business, a lot of the business wants to move to an Agile methodology. It's what's in vogue right now. It's the methodology that a lot of businesses are moving towards. And the reason why a lot of businesses are going into Agile is because there is deeper collaboration with the business. So the benefit of Agile over Waterfall is in Waterfall, teams gather requirements, right? So at the beginning of a Waterfall project, we'll get together and we'll work with the business and say, you know, what are your requirements, right? Give us what you want this solution to do for you. What are the pain points that you want us to address? And we gather all that, and then we go and create solution design documents. And those solution design documents basically are a blueprint for how we intend to address those pain points and to meet those problems, right? And so then there's some collaboration with the business to make sure that those solution design documents are correct. And once we agree upon that, then the development team goes off into a cave and starts to build, right? So what happens is they emerge from that cave with this solution that we hand over to the business and say, here's what you agreed to, here's what we've built, go forth and prosper, right? And so we lose that connection a little bit, right, in the build and the creation of the solution design documents, where in Agile, the business and the development team, we're collaborating the entire time. So when we're talking about requirements, we're turning those requirements into what's called user stories. And those user stories is the team basically working with the business to detail out, what are your expected outcomes? What is it we're solving? And we create those into small chunks that are user stories. We define what the success criteria is for every user story, right? And then as soon as that piece of functionality is built, that one piece of functionality is built, it's handed over to the product owner and the business to try it out and make sure that it meets those needs, right? And so rather than having to, wait any length of time for us to build a full solution, we build pieces of that solution and say, hey, go test this out, business owner, right? Go test this out. Let's make sure that it meets your requirements, it meets your success criteria, and it actually fits the process, right? Because a lot of times we're designing a process up front that you have not used yet, right? So that collaboration happens throughout. It's a full team effort. The other piece is better scope visibility.
Oh, Libryia, I'm going to jump in before you move on. I do want to call out that I think the additional collaboration and the deeper collaborative nature of Agile is unique to MDM in this regard. Because frequently, in my experience, having gone through the contract negotiations, and I see we have some salespeople on the team on the line, so they can, I guess, agree with this. Frequently, IT is paying for MDM implementations, but we're building them to serve the business. So when we do Waterfall and we go off in that cave and build, frequently those design documents are built with IT. And then when we hand the solution over to the business, they feel like they're completely left out and their needs have not been met at all. And so I think Agile in general with MDM implementations kind of bridges that gap and guarantees that the business is going to be collaborating all along, so that even if the funds are not coming from the business, you're going to make sure your business users accept the solution at the end of MVP.
Yep. No, that's a very, very good point. And having the business collaborating throughout means that their needs are heard, their wants and desires are heard, and also that the final solution has their fingerprint on it throughout, right? Because they've participated in every step of the way of that process. Very good call out. Thanks, Allyson. The other piece is better scope visibility. So often, and I think a lot of us can agree with this, and I think even the sales negotiation conversation over to the IT team is a good call out for this. The sheer size of the scope can get buried in waterfall methodology, right? Because we go and build these solution design documents, create these solution design documents, and they're truly a stack of papers that represent something the team's going to build in a set timeline. And there's no easy way to correlate what's in those pages to the level of effort, right? We are estimating a timeline for what's in those pages. But in an agile methodology, the scope's front and center, right? We create these user stories and we actually assign points to those user stories based on a level of effort, based on what we see as a level of effort for every single requirement and every single piece of functionality that we're building. And the team has a velocity, which is the amount of points that they can complete in a certain time frame. So if we've got a sprint that's 2 weeks and we've got a team that can get 30 points, that can get 25 points done, right? And our overall scope is 100 points, then we know that we're going to be able to get this done in 4 sprints, right? If otherwise, and then if those numbers start to grow, right? If we're creating additional scope and creating additional user stories, leadership gets to see exactly how that's expanding almost immediately. A lot of times on Waterfall project, that kind of gets buried, right? As the business is making changes to the design during the build phase, it starts expanding without that visibility bubbling up. And so in Agile, it makes it a lot easier for us to say, well, every single change that we make is represented in a story with the level of effort. And after that, it's just math, right? So that we can see what's happening with scope. All right, and then the other one is consistently delivering value. So one of the great things about Agile is that every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, however long your sprint is, functionality is handed over to the business to use, to test, to work with. And it allows us to easily illustrate to leadership that progress is being made towards a broader goal, right? So in Waterfall, we can say that we're going to build this full solution, but leadership and the business don't get to see that solution until it's complete for the most part. But in Agile, every 2 weeks, you see a part of that solution. You start to see it come together. And it becomes really important when you need to represent to leadership that progress is being made, that value is being delivered. And then you've got increased flexibility. So because we are delivering value and giving the business the opportunity to test and use the functionality, they also now have the flexibility to learn and adjust, right? So one of the goals of Agile is to fail fast and make corrections fast. And when the functionality is in the hands of the business, they can do that, right? Whereas with Agile, if we hand over the functionality after having spent weeks or a month or months building it, and we've got to unravel something, then it makes it a little bit more difficult. When in Agile, we're building small chunks of that functionality and saying, hey, does this work for you, right? And it helps us pivot for the future faster, right? So even if we're not failing, but now we're rethinking a future requirement that we had, we may want to change the way we were doing this, or we may want to change this process. It allows for that level of flexibility. All right, we can go on to the next one. Let's talk about when it's best to use Agile, because there are situations in which it may not be best to use Agile. So we'll talk about when it is best to use Agile. I'm going to go with the good, better, best. Good scenarios are where implementations where leadership needs to see regular value delivery. And I'll give you an example. So MDM implementations can have really long tails. I know that I know that many of us can speak to that. Some MDM projects just struggle for various reasons, right? Either the business wants to boil the ocean, or there's just not enough definition of what the solution is going to be. In either case, MDM solutions can have a long tail. And so when this happens, it ends up becoming a challenge for leadership to justify the investment or to continue to make investments. And we've been engaged with a few clients to help accelerate MDM projects that have been lagging, that's been in that situation. I'm actually currently running an MDM project with a client who's been working for about a year to get their solution delivered. And so in this instance, it was important that we run this as an Agile project so that leadership could see real progress on a bi-weekly basis and just regain the confidence that the project would be successful, right? And so I'm happy to say that we've been able to consistently deliver value, right? So every 2 weeks, our sprints are 2 weeks. And so every 2 weeks, they're able to see that there is functionality being built. And not just functionality being built, but functionality that will actually be used by the business and will make the business's process even better and start to create that source of truth for their business. And I'm very, very happy to say that within 2.5 months, we've been able to complete the build of all of their functionality requirements that they have defined as MVP. And as of today, we are kicking off QA end-to-end testing. So that's a big deal. So that's an example of when it's a really good idea to go ahead and move to an Agile methodology. Another one is when implementations are where the connection between scope and timing are unclear for the leadership or the business. And so an example that I have there's often, and we were having a conversation earlier today about the fact that there can be a disconnect between the business and IT, right? Often IT holds the budget and the business has the requirements, right? So the business is often asking for a Lambo and IT's budgeted for an Acura, right? And so it's hard for the business to see where that gap is, right? It's hard for the business to see that I'm asking for something that's a lot bigger than what fits our budget or what fits our schedule. And so one of the major Agile projects I ran, the last major Agile project I ran, we had this issue where the client's RT department was really concerned that the business didn't have a feel for how large their scope really was. They were literally asking for a Lambo and didn't feel like that's what they were asking for. They were asking for all the bells and whistles. They were trying to boil the ocean and do all of the things with all of the shiny automations and everything. And so we actually end up switching to Agile and wrote out the stories and scored the stories so that we could show the business that based on what they were asking for, it would have pretty much tripled their timeline based on those asks. And moving to Agile basically put us in a position where we could literally show them that this is the scope that you've requested. So why don't we carve out the scope for MVP, for what you actually need in order to use this solution and to test it out. And that actually brings me to the better example. So when MVP is clearly defined, it makes it so much easier to manage the PM triangle, which is scope, schedule, and budget. And so for this client, once we were able to get them to carve out some of the shiny things, the bells and whistles, and build a system that they could use, test, and work from, we were able to get them to a much better timeline. And what that does is it puts the business in a position, business and IT in a position where they can say, look, we delivered this value. We've learned this from the system. These are the enhancements that we'd like to make. Let's get more investment to do that. And that actually brings me to the best scenario. The best scenario is when you have a system that you have put into place, you've defined MVP, and now you are learning and growing from that solution and defining enhancements and follow-on phases to that. That's it. All right, let's get into why not Agile. So we've talked about why to use Agile, when to use Agile. Let's talk about why not to use Agile, because there are definitely some challenges. And one thing that I want to say here is that Agile is not magic. I get the impression that a lot of times clients assume that moving to Agile will solve all of their problems from a scope, schedule, and budget standpoint. And that's not the case. Agile is not magic. There are times where Agile is more effective, and there's times where Waterfall may be more effective, right? And so I want to call out some of the challenges with Agile. It is a very, very effective project methodology, and so is Waterfall. And both of them come with their challenges. The challenges for Agile are that scope are not fully defined up front. Now, I know I mentioned that as a benefit earlier, but I want to call this out because this is something that often makes the business uncomfortable. It's really tough to get the business's mind around, we won't know exactly what you're going to build at the end of this, right? But I think one of the challenges, one of the things that we've got to get the business's mind wrapped around is that the business gets to define that scope throughout the process, right? And so it just has to be clearly defined that these are the parameters for what we're going to build for MVP, and that scope in MVP can change and adjust, but the business gets to define that. It won't be defined up front, and it's okay, right? You get to be flexible, but also flexibility reduces predictability, which means that it often makes it very challenging to manage the schedule, the budget, and like I said, the scope, because that can change because you're being flexible now, right? So it's possible that you've defined some functionality, right? The business has defined this functionality, we've built it, we've tested, and then we get it into the end user's hand, and it doesn't necessarily work for the end users the way they expected, right? And let's say we're 2 sprints in. So now we have to be flexible. We have to readjust and we have to pivot. It's great that we can do that, right? Because at the end of the day, we want a workable solution for our end users. But also keep in mind that reduces our ability to predict schedule, budget, and scope. It makes it challenging to do that. Not saying that you cannot, but it does make it challenging to do that. And as we said earlier, there is a lot more collaboration from the business, right? The business has their fingerprint in this thing all throughout. What that also means is that there's a lot more time commitment from the business. I can tell you on every Agile project that I've had, the product owner from the business is heavily involved in all of the Agile ceremonies, right? So they're participating in developing user stories. They're participating in backlog sessions where we're going through user stories and making sure that we understand exactly what those requirements are and solutioning for those stories. And then they're also participating in testing, right? Because once the build is complete, we hand it over to the product owners to go and test it and make sure it meets their acceptance criteria. And then the product owners are often educating the end users on how to use this and how to use the functionality and how the functionality benefits them. They're also accepting requirements from the end users as well to make those updates. So there is a lot of a time commitment from the business. This is a plus and a minus. So those are some of the challenges with Agile. I'm gonna go into adjusting to the Agile mindset. So if any of you are on projects or have been thinking about getting on projects that you want to move to Agile, there's a couple of things that need to be done in advance of getting to Agile. So historically, projects have been run Waterfall. It's just been the method for a very long time. And a lot of companies are very, very comfortable with Waterfall. There is nothing wrong with that, but the experience that I've had is it does require some adjustment to move into Agile. And the very first thing is making sure that everybody's on board with Agile. First with the why. We got to know why we went to Agile in the first place, right? It can't be that it's just the new methodology. That's what we're doing. This is the cool, new, sexy thing that everyone's doing in the software development space and the MDM space. So let's go and do it. We've got to know truly why we're moving to Agile. Are we moving to Agile because we want to see rapid delivery, because we want the business to get very, very clear on the minimum viable product that they want to deliver? Why are we moving to Agile? Is it to increase visibility? Is it to make sure that the business is more is collaborating more? Just making sure that everybody has that understanding is going to be very, very key. The other piece is making sure that everyone understands that value will come in cycles. So value will come in 2 to 4 week cycles, however long your sprints are. And that value will be slightly piecemeal, right? And so the very first time, a good example I have of this is very early on in one of our Agile projects, we did demos for functionality that buyers were going to use. This for a retail client. And it was a bit challenging getting them to accept and understand and be on board with the demos that they were seeing, because it wasn't complete, right? This is the first part of a bigger process that we will build out later. And so beforehand, it wasn't clear to that audience and to that group. These were the end users. It was not clear to that audience that value would be delivered in cycles and it would be chunks of value, right? So today we're going to build out how you can ingest products. In the next 2 weeks, we're going to build out how you enrich those products, right? And so we're going to keep building on top of this thing. And that unfortunately was not completely explained to that group, right? And so it's very, very important that everybody understands that value is going to be delivered in cycles. And it's just not going to be an everything at once approach. The other piece is making sure that we're setting guardrails, right? So guardrails do need to be set. I know I've said a number of times that Agile is flexible, right? And we get to be flexible with scope, but in the real world, that's not how projects are run, right? So there is some flexibility, but guardrails do have to be set. And one element can change, but the others can't, right? So we talk about the PM triangle: schedule, budget, and scope. It's possible to adjust scope, right? Scope is the one that's going to more than likely adjust, but it still needs to adjust within parameters. And so the ways around that is to make sure that leadership understands how to place the guardrails around that scope and is driving those guardrails, right? And so we talked a moment ago about how there can be a disconnect. If IT owns the budget and business owns the requirements, then a lot of times there's a conflict of interest, right? So the business has all these requirements they want, but IT is held accountable to a specific budget, and both are held accountable to schedule. So it's really important that everyone's on the same page about how scope is going to impact schedule and budget. One way to manage that is release management. So like I said, the scope can change on a regular basis, but you can identify larger themes that will be released. So you may say that in our first release, which will be 3 or 4 months, 6 months, we're going to deliver product onboarding functionality. In our second release, we're going to be able to launch vendor onboarding functionality. So that's one of the ways that you can start to put guardrails around it. Now, the scope within product creation may be that some of this is manual work. And then in phase 2, we may do some automated work, but you can create guardrails around it. So I've said it's flexible, but it is flexible to an extent. And it will be important that IT and leadership put those guardrails and stick to those. All right, so the other thing is training and preparing teams. So I mentioned earlier about end users not being aware of the iterative nature of delivery. It's important also that teams are trained and prepared, right? So it's a really, really heavy time commitment on the business, the product owner, whomever is assigned that role as product owner. So it's important that they completely understand what that role encompasses. And one of the things that I'm very appreciative that one of our clients did, was they actually enlisted the help of an Agile coach. So before we end up going to Agile, before we switch to Agile, they actually had an Agile coach come on site and talk to them about exactly what Agile is, what's expected of them, what the time commitments are. They got together and set up all of the Agile ceremonies and got really, really clear on the nuances of the methodology. So I don't think that you'll lose anything by putting in some effort to train and prepare your teams, and also to get clear on how we'll track, monitor, and report the project, because it's not going to be as straightforward as Waterfall. There's very specific ways you can report out on an Agile project. So training and preparing the teams for all of that is kind of a big deal. And the third is defining MVP. And this is the most challenging of the Agile mindsets, because like I said, the business always wants a Lamborghini, am I right? The business always wants everything. And so it's really, really important that when we're moving to an Agile mindset, that we get clear, we wrap our minds around the idea of a minimum viable product. So let's talk about that in more detail on the next slide. Let me grab a sip of water. Okay, so what is a minimum viable product? MVP is the effective version of a solution that will allow end users to test, learn, and provide feedback. That's my own definition of it. And it is very challenging. I will tell you, I've had a client define their MVP. So we built out all of their stories, right? We created all of their stories, we put them in a tracking tool. And I said, well, let's go through these stories and define what of these are minimum viable product. In my mind, a minimum viable product, if we're sticking with the car, it's a bucket and wheels, right? It's gonna get you where you've got to go. And after they did the exercise of identifying their MVP, I noticed that 80% of their stories, 80, 85, almost 90% of their stories were MVP. And I'm like, guys, that's not MVP, that's the product. That's still the Lambo, right? It's at least the Acura, but it's not an MVP. And so this has been one of the most challenging pieces for me as an Agile practitioner, to getting clients to define MVP. And the reason it's so hard is because the business wants everything. They want all of it, right? They want everything that they've asked for. The other piece is there is fear with the business around having end users getting into a system that's no better than their current process. If any of you have been on an Agile project, if any of you have been on any MDM project, you've heard the business say, I don't want to implement a system that's no better than what we're already doing, right? And so they have this fear that if they don't add all these bells and whistles, if they don't add all these shiny new things, then the end users, their buyers, their advertising group, any of their end users is basically going to be doing exactly what they were doing before, which becomes a change management process. The other piece is a lot of times when we ask the business to define what MVP is and say, let's go build this first, they fear doing that because they're not clear on when they'll be able to get the gap between what they have and what they want, right? And so I think in that case, it's really important for leadership to help define what a roadmap is for their functionality, right? So for the business, here's the solution that you want. Let's build out that roadmap, right? And maybe in the first 4-6 months, we're just going to do MVP, but here's when I'm going to give you the rest of it, right? Here's where we're going to do those enhancements and give you the rest of it. That makes it a little bit easier and takes some of the pressure off from the business and helps them get their minds around, okay, what is the minimum functionality that I can move forward with now, right? And then the other piece is what I've been talking about throughout this, the disconnected value propositions between the business and IT, right? So it's a conflict of interest. The IT, again, typically owns the budget and the schedule, and the business owns change management and owns the ability to make sure that this functionality is usable and will be used. And so they're going to focus more on making sure that they have all the requirements met to do just that, right? And so a lot of times those value propositions just aren't connected. And I think that when business and IT come together, and like I said, to build that roadmap, it becomes a lot easier to kind of carve out what MVP is. But in order for any Agile MDM project to be successful, that has to be defined. Let's go on to the next slide, because we want to talk about how it also needs, let me give you some tips on defining MVP right quick. So defining MVP can't just be, let's chop off the amount of stories that fit into our schedule, right? So that's kind of the easiest thing, right? We can say, let's look at all these story points. It's math. We've got this much time. Let's figure out how many points we can do. But when we do that, right, we want to make sure that it's got to be a minimally comfortable solution. Because like I said, at the end of the day, the business and IT are challenged with change management and making sure that it's adopted. We want to build a solution that people are going to use. And so one of the things that I typically suggest or recommend is that we think about what are the immediate problems that need to be solved, right? It can be a big problem. It can be low-hanging fruit. It can be a major pain point, or it can be, we can tackle these 3 low-hanging fruit pieces, right? So it often cannot be, let's take what we're doing now and go and put it into a system. It's got to be at least a little bit better, right? Because that's why we invested in an MDM tool, because we want this process to be a better than what we're doing now. And so what I typically recommend to clients is that we think about what's minimally comfortable and what delivers some value to our end users without expanding scope too much, right? And so if we can focus on that, that gets us to defining MVP. And once we define MVP, we've got to protect it. So we'll talk about that on the next slide. Protecting MVP becomes our major. So we've got a number of jobs on any MDM project, right? Everybody's job is to protect MVP. We are now all guardians of MVP, because throughout the course of an implementation, MVP may grow, right? We're going to test things, we're going to see things, we're going to want to add. The business is going to revert back to wanting all of the shiny things, right? And we've got to go back and say, this is what MVP is, this is what we've agreed to, and we've got to deliver this so that we can get support from leadership to invest in the enhancements and the additional roadmap that we've mapped out, right? And so a couple of tips that I'm going to throw out there just to protect MVP is to focus on writing out MVP and scoring those stories first, right? So if we have not built out our entire solution and built out all those user stories, we're going to take and say, this is the minimum solution that we could build, and we're going to write those stories. And then we're going to baseline and track that. The only way to protect MVP is to baseline it and say, we've got 100 points that represent our MVP stories, right? And give that visibility to leadership so that they can see how that grows. So if we're adding stories to MVP, right, that also means that we are adding time to the project. So if we've got 100 MVP stories, and then within 2 or 3 sprints, we're adding 20 MVP stories, we've just added time to the project, right? And so leadership needs that visibility and to take ownership of saying, well, if we're adding 20 points to MVP, then 20 points need to come out if we're going to keep our schedule in our budget, right? And so that constant visibility, not just for leadership and for sponsors, but for the entire team, pretty much gets everybody held accountable to protecting MVP. So if I can leave you with one thing, it's defining MVP and making sure that it is visible so that you can protect it. It's very, very important to protect MVP. That's one of the things that I preach to my clients all the time. We are all protectors of MVP, which means that we are all protectors of the budget, schedule, and scope. Okay. All right, that's it. Let's do some key takeaways. That is the last slide. So key takeaways from this that I want you guys to get to is to make sure you understand why you're doing an Agile project. That is the first one. Understand why this project is going to be Agile. Again, can't just be because it's the new sexy thing. There's gotta be a reason. Everybody's gotta understand that. And then the second is understanding what you're gonna gain and give up, right? So moving into Agile, you're gaining some things and you're giving up some things, and everybody's gotta be okay with that. And then the last thing is making sure that the team completely understands the Agile methodology and is completely bought into the mindset, right? So if everybody's on board and everybody gets it, then the Agile project and MDM is going to go a lot smoother and be a lot more successful. That's it. Any questions, guys? Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Libryia and Allyson. Very educational session for our audience and for myself as well. We do have a few questions. The first question, have you ever switched methodologies during a project from Agile to Waterfall or from Waterfall to Agile?
Yes, both. Yes to both. So I think I mentioned it earlier that we had a project where the business was asking for all the things in the world because it happens, right? And no knock on the business at the end of the day. Like I said, their goal is to make their process as seamless as possible and to ensure that they've got data integrity, right? And so no knock on the business for asking for all of the things. The challenge is for asking all of the things in a limited amount of time with a limited budget. And so I was in a project where it was originally supposed to be a waterfall project, and the business's requests were larger than the time frame, and it was very difficult to illustrate that. And so we moved to Agile in order to turn it into math, right? Because it's when we make it math, when we turn it into Agile and make it user stories that are scored with points, and we have an estimated velocity for a team, and we know what our timeline is, we know exactly how many points we can fit into that. And so it made it a lot easier to illustrate to the business and to leadership what the size of the scope was and where we need to carve out. And I've switched from Agile to Waterfall before because, like I said, Agile makes it very flexible. Scope becomes flexible. And so we had a situation where leadership, there weren't many guardrails around the business adding user stories and adding new requirements, and scope continued to grow. And our recommendation was that, you know what, let us step away from the Agile methodology for just a moment and build a base system. So we're going to build a base example of product creation, product maintenance, and product enrichment that would work. It was for a retail client that would work at most retail clients. So we're going to step away and go into our cave and build a standard product creation workflow, and then come back and share that with you guys. And then we'll go and start to add on and enhance it, right? Because if we continue to focus on the shiny bells and whistles, we won't get the base functionality down. And so in that case, we had to move back to Waterfall temporarily so that we can get that foundation built for the client.
Thank you, Libryia. Those are great examples. Another question we have, in a waterfall implementation, there's a lot of work up front to design and develop documents. In Agile, there's also a lot of work to define MVP up front. So what's the difference in the effort and the scope of that work between the two methodologies?
Okay, good question. So the question is basically, upfront in Waterfall, there's a lot of effort put into building solution design documents. And in Agile, there's a lot of work up front to build out user stories and to define MVP. And what's the difference? Honestly, the difference is what we're committing to up front, right? So when we define solution design documents, when we build the solution design documents in Waterfall, we're committing to what the full solution looks like up front. without having tested or used the system, right? So a lot of times the business owners have not used the system. They don't know enough. They don't know enough about the system, right, to include that system knowledge into their requirements. And so it's an agreement up front about what a full solution will look like. Whereas MVP is agreement up front about what a carved out, minimalized piece of that solution will look like, so that we can use it, learn, and grow from it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you for that clarification. The last question I see, if scope is a moving target in Agile, how does leadership get comfortable that these projects are being controlled?
Yeah, so that actually goes back to what I mentioned earlier about making sure that there's visibility into what scope is, right? So I think it's important, always important in an Agile project, that we define what the scope is, what our agreements are from a standpoint of, we have agreed to complete 150 points in 6 months, right? In X number of sprints. And on a regular basis, let's report out on, is that scope, are we chunking away at that scope? Are we carving away at that scope? Is it going down or is it going up? And pressing on leadership to make sure that they're putting the guardrails and saying that either, yes, it's okay for us to continue to expand and add new requirements and new stories, or no, it's not okay. And if we're going to add stories, you're going to have to take something out, right? And so it really goes back to the visibility and to making sure that leadership is holding to those guardrails and protecting whatever scope we agree to.
Great, thank you, Libryia. I do not see any other questions. So Libryia and Allyson, thank you again for such a great session, and thank you for everyone who attended. Tomorrow's session is featuring Emeka Nwosu of Products App, and he'll be discussing breaking through digital walls and driving sales with automated data syndication to your e-commerce channels. So don't forget to check on our upcoming sessions and register so that way you can receive the login details. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.